July 11th, 1943, 2200 hours. Over the Mediterranean Sea, approaching the southern coast of Sicily, Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Tucker gripped the frame of the open door in his C-47 transport as the night sky transformed into a curtain of fire. Tracer rounds arced upward like deadly fireworks. Orange bursts of 40mm shells detonated at altitude. The thunder of anti-aircraft fire rolled across the water. Every gun on every Allied ship below was firing at his aircraft, at the planes carrying his men, at the 144 C-47s of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The formation had crossed from Tunisia without incident. The pilots maintained tight spacing. The paratroopers sat on their benches, weighted down with equipment, weapons, ammunition. They had rehearsed this jump dozens of times. They knew their objectives: secure the beachhead, protect the landing zones, link up with the forces coming ashore at dawn. This should have been a routine combat drop. Then the first shells hit. The radio operator in the lead plane screamed into his microphone, his voice breaking with desperation. "We are American paratroopers. Stop firing, stop firing." The transmission went out on the correct frequency, but coordination between services had failed. Most ships never received notification about the operation. The gunners below had no idea friendly aircraft were approaching. They knew only that German bombers had attacked just 15 minutes earlier. They saw aircraft silhouettes. They fired. The carnage unfolded in minutes. Transport planes exploded in mid-air, disintegrating into balls of flame that tumbled toward the sea. Others, struck by multiple shells, caught fire and struggled to maintain altitude. Pilots fought controls as engines died and wings tore away. Some tried to reach the shore. Some attempted emergency ditches in the Mediterranean. Few succeeded. Inside the stricken aircraft, paratroopers faced impossible choices. Jump into darkness over the sea, weighted down with 70 pounds of equipment, almost certainly drowning. Stay with the burning plane and die in the crash. Some jumped anyway. They splashed into the water in full combat gear. The weight dragged them under. Some managed to cut away their equipment and swim. Most did not resurface. Others jumped over land but descended into a nightmare. Allied anti-aircraft guns on the beaches tracked them as they floated down. Gunners, unable to distinguish friend from foe, opened fire on men hanging helpless beneath their parachutes. Paratroopers died in the air, riddled with bullets meant to protect them. Within 20 minutes, 23 C-47 transports were shot down. 37 more sustained heavy damage so severe they would never fly combat missions again. 81 men were killed outright. 318 more were wounded. Among the dead was Brigadier General Charles Kieran's, Assistant Division Commander, killed when his transport was hit, senior leadership dying in friendly fire, the nightmare scenario. Tucker survived the night. His aircraft made it through the gauntlet of fire. He landed with his remaining men and fought through the night to secure objectives. But as dawn broke over Sicily, as he stood on blood-soaked sand watching rescue boats pull bodies from the Mediterranean, watching medics work frantically on the wounded, watching dog tags being collected from the dead, he made a silent vow. This would never happen again. Never. Not on his watch. Not to his men. Not to any American soldier. What Tucker did not know, what no one could have predicted, was that this catastrophic night would trigger the most successful aircraft identification system in military history. A solution so simple that ground crews could paint it in hours, so distinctive that gunners could recognize it in seconds, so effective that it would save hundreds of aircraft and thousands of lives during the largest invasion ever attempted. The transformation would begin, not with complex radar systems or sophisticated electronics, but with the most basic tools imaginable. Paintbrushes, black paint, white paint, and the desperate determination to ensure that American forces would never again slaughter their own. The tragedy had been building for months. Since early 1943, Allied planners knew that the invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe would require air superiority on a scale never before attempted. thousands of aircraft would fill the skies simultaneously. Fighters, bombers, transports, gliders, reconnaissance planes, all operating in the same airspace, all vulnerable to the same terrible mistake. The existing identification system seemed adequate on paper. Every Allied aircraft carried standard national markings. American planes displayed white stars on blue circles. British aircraft bore red, white, and blue roundels. These symbols had worked well enough when air operations involved dozens of planes. But Operation Overlord, the planned invasion of France, would involve not dozens but thousands. More than 13,000 Allied aircraft would participate in the initial assault alone. The technology designed to prevent friendly fire was called Identification Friend or Foe, known as IFF. This electronic system used radio transponders that received interrogation signals from the ground and transmitted friendly responses. In theory, every Allied aircraft would identify itself electronically to every anti-aircraft battery and every fighter pilot. In practice, the system had severe limitations. Lieutenant Commander William McGarry of the United States Navy understood these limitations better than most. In early 1943, he commanded the USS Jeffers, a destroyer escort assigned to protect the invasion fleet approaching Sicily. McGarry had requested that his crew receive specialized training in, quote, aircraft recognition. The Navy had established a school in Columbus, Ohio, specifically for this purpose. The Renshaw course, as it was called, used innovative techniques to train gunners to identify aircraft silhouettes in fractions of a second. Ensign Donald McClurg, 25 years old, completed the Renshaw course in early 1943. He joined the Jeffers in Norfolk, Virginia, on June 5th. For 34 days, until the ship sailed for Sicily on July 9th, McClurg drilled every officer and crew member on aircraft recognition, every single day. Multiple sessions, no exceptions. The discipline proved critical. On the night of July 11th, 1943, when C-47 transports appeared over the invasion fleet, most ships opened fire immediately. The Jeffers did not. McGarry's crew recognized the aircraft silhouettes despite the chaos, despite the darkness, despite having just endured German bomber attacks. The Jeffers was one of the few ships that did not fire on American paratroopers that night. But the Jeffers was the exception. Most ships had not received the Renshaw training. Most crews were operating on raw nerves after days of combat. Just 15 minutes before the C-47s arrived, German Junkers 88 bombers had attacked the fleet. The Ju-88 had a twin-engine configuration similar to the C-47. In darkness, under stress, with adrenaline coursing through exhausted bodies, the distinction became impossible. The official U.S. Army history described the scene with brutal honesty. The slow-flying, majestic columns of aircraft were like sitting ducks. Dozens of transport planes were hit. One exploded in midair. Others, on fire, tried to ditch in the sea to save the paratroopers inside. Squadrons broke apart, tried to reform, scattered again. 8 pilots turned back to Tunisia, still carrying their paratroopers, unable to penetrate the wall of fire. Major General Matthew Ridgway, commander of the 82nd Airborne Division, watched the disaster unfold from a ship off the Sicilian coast. He had expressed concerns about the operation before it launched. Naval commanders had told him they could not guarantee the safety of his aircraft. They had actually said those words, "Cannot guarantee safety." Ridgway had been given assurances that all ships would be informed about the paratrooper transport planes passing overhead. Many ship commanders later insisted they never received those orders. The investigation that followed identified multiple failures. Ground commanders had not adequately alerted their troops about the upcoming airborne mission. The paratroopers and infantry on the beach used different passwords, creating confusion when jumpers landed among friendly forces. The C-47s carried yellow recognition lights on their bellies, but gunners either did not see them or did not recognize their significance. Communication between services had broken down at every level. But the fundamental problem was simpler and more intractable. Human beings under extreme stress cannot reliably identify aircraft by silhouette alone. Not in darkness, not when recently attacked, not when the cost of hesitation might be death. Fire discipline, no matter how well trained, collapses when bombs are falling and ships are sinking. Ridgway understood this. In his report written in August 1943, he acknowledged the deplorable loss of life, but he also wrote something that would prove prophetic. I believe that the lessons now learned could have been driven home in no other way, and that these lessons provide a sound basis for the belief that recurrences can be avoided. The lessons were learned immediately. 2 months later, on September 9, 1943, American troops invaded mainland Italy at Salerno. Within 4 days, German counterattacks threatened the beachhead. Lieutenant General Mark Clark, the invasion commander, called for the 82nd Airborne as emergency reinforcements. "This is a must," he told Ridgway. Ridgway had one condition. Rigid control of anti-aircraft fire is absolutely essential. This time, Clark listened. He personally ordered all anti-aircraft batteries, on ships and ashore, to hold their fire from 9 in the evening until further notice. Clark met face-to-face with naval and ground commanders. He sent representatives to deliver the order in person to every single unit. The C-47s flew a route that skirted the invasion fleet. When the 504th jumped shortly before midnight on September 13th, not a single shot was fired at them. Not one. The success vindicated Ridgway's insistence. It also demonstrated that friendly fire could be prevented with proper communication and discipline, but it required perfect coordination, perfect timing, perfect execution. One breakdown anywhere in the chain, and soldiers died. The solution that would emerge was already being tested, though few realized its significance. In late 1942, the Royal Air Force had encountered a different identification problem that seemed unrelated to the Sicily disaster, but would prove crucial to solving it. The new Hawker Typhoon fighter had entered service as a low-altitude interceptor designed to counter German hit-and-run raids. It was fast, capable of 412 miles per hour at low altitude. It was heavily armed with 4 20mm cannons. It was perfectly suited for its role defending Britain's southern coast against Focke-Wulf 190 fighter bombers. It also looked almost exactly like the Focke-Wulf 190 from certain angles. The resemblance was uncanny and deadly. Allied anti-aircraft gunners shot down multiple Typhoons in the first months of operations. Exact numbers were never officially recorded, but squadron records document dozens of incidents. RAF pilots, exhausted from combat missions over occupied France, would cross the English coast and suddenly find themselves under fire from their own defences. Some managed to take evasive action and survive. Some were wounded by British bullets. Some were killed by British shells. Friendly fire from friendly forces protecting friendly territory. The similarity between the Typhoon's profile and the FW-190 was not superficial. Both aircraft had large chin-mounted radiators for their liquid-cooled engines. Both had similar overall dimensions and wing configurations. Both had inline engines with distinctive cowlings. Both operated at low altitude where recognition was most difficult. Both approached from the same direction, crossing the English Channel from occupied France. In the split second available to make a firing decision, with an aircraft closing at 400 miles per hour, the difference was effectively invisible. Pilots complained bitterly. Ground gunners defended their actions, pointing out that hesitation could mean a German bomber reached its target. RAF leadership recognized the problem, but struggled to find a solution. Standard aircraft recognition training emphasized silhouette identification. Gunners learned to distinguish aircraft by engine number, wing configuration, tail shape. But those distinctions required time and clear visibility. In combat conditions, with seconds to react, training often failed. The RAF tried several solutions. They painted the Typhoon's nose completely white, creating a distinctive marking visible from any angle. This helped, but was not sufficient. Gunners still hesitated. Pilots still died. Finally, in December 1942, the RAF implemented a new system. They painted high-visibility black and white stripes on the underside of the Typhoon's wings. The stripes were simple. Alternating bands of black and white, each approximately 12 inches wide, extending across the full wingspan. From the ground, the pattern was unmistakable. No German aircraft carried such markings. The stripes could be seen at a distance and identified instantly. The solution worked. Friendly fire incidents involving Typhoons dropped dramatically. The success did not go unnoticed. RAF planners filed reports on the effectiveness of the wing stripes. The system was noted as a precursor to possible future identification schemes. But in early 1943, no one imagined applying such markings to thousands of aircraft simultaneously. The logistics alone seemed impossible. Then Sicily happened. Then Salerno. Then the magnitude of Operation Overlord began to emerge. Allied planners projected that on D-Day alone, more than 14,000 aircraft sorties would be flown over the invasion beaches. Fighters providing air cover, medium bombers attacking coastal defences, light bombers supporting ground troops, transport planes dropping paratroopers, gliders landing infantry. Photo reconnaissance aircraft documenting the assault, air-sea rescue planes ready to planes, retrieve downed pilots. All of these aircraft would be operating in the same airspace. Many would be flying at low altitude, within range of naval anti-aircraft guns. The invasion fleet would include thousands of ships, many equipped with automatic weapons designed to fire at any aircraft that approached. Ship crews would be under attack from German aircraft. They would be exhausted, stressed, frightened. The conditions would be identical to Sicily, but multiplied by a factor of 10. In March 1944, a study group examined the problem in detail. They calculated how many IFF interrogation signals would be transmitted simultaneously during the invasion. They modeled how many aircraft would be within range of each transmitter. They analyzed the capacity of the IFF system to handle multiple simultaneous responses. The conclusion was unambiguous. The IFF system would be saturated and break down. The existing technology could not handle the volume of aircraft. Electronic identification would fail precisely when it was most needed. Friendly fire incidents were not just possible. They were inevitable. Hundreds of aircraft would be shot down by Allied guns unless a new solution was found. Air Chief Marshal Sir Trafford Leigh-Mallory commanded the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, the Supreme Air Commander for Operation Overlord. Every aircraft involved in the invasion reported to him. The responsibility for preventing another Sicily fell directly on his shoulders. Leigh-Mallory reviewed the study group's findings. He consulted with his staff. He examined the RAF's experience with Typhoon wing stripes. He made a decision that would save thousands of lives. On May 17, 1944, 20 days before D-Day, Leigh-Mallory approved a revolutionary marking scheme. All Allied aircraft participating in Operation Overlord would be painted with alternating black and white stripes, not just on the wings, on both wings and the fuselage, 5 stripes total. 3 white, 2 black, arranged in a pattern impossible to mistake. The specifications were precise. On single-engine aircraft, each stripe would be 18 inches wide. On twin-engine aircraft, 24 inches wide. The stripes would wrap around the fuselage just forward of the tail section. They would cover the wings from front to back, top and bottom. Every aircraft that might fly over Allied anti-aircraft defences would carry these markings. Fighters, light bombers, medium bombers, transports, gliders, photo reconnaissance aircraft, air-sea rescue planes, even coastal command aircraft whose duties might bring them over the invasion fleet. The order specifically exempted heavy 4-engine bombers. The B-17s and B-24s of the U.S. 8th Air Force, the Lancasters of RAF Bomber Command. These aircraft had distinctive silhouettes that could not be confused with German bombers. The Luftwaffe operated few heavy bombers. The Heinkel 177 and Fokker Wolf 200 Condor were rare. An Allied gunner seeing a 4-engine bomber could safely assume it was friendly. but every other aircraft required the stripes. The scale of the operation was staggering. Thousands of aircraft would need to be painted. Ground crews were already working around the clock preparing planes for the invasion. Maintenance schedules were packed. Spare time did not exist. Now they would need to mask off roundels and serial numbers, mix hundreds of gallons of paint, and apply stripes to thousands of aircraft, all without disrupting combat operations. The security implications were equally challenging. If German intelligence learned about the invasion stripes, they could paint similar markings on their own aircraft. The entire system would collapse. Worse, the timing of the stripe painting would signal when the invasion was imminent. Every intelligence officer in occupied Europe was watching for signs of Allied preparations. Suddenly painting every aircraft in Britain would be an unmistakable indicator. Lee Mallory made another critical decision. The stripe painting would not begin until the last possible moment. The order would be held at the highest classification level. No aircraft would be painted until D-Day was imminent. When the order came, it would be executed immediately, within hours, not days. Security and speed were both essential. On June 1, 1944, a small test flight was conducted. A handful of aircraft, already painted with invasion stripes, flew over the assembled Operation Overlord fleet. The exercise was designed to familiarize ship crews with the new markings. Sailors and gunners watched as the striped aircraft passed overhead. They were told these markings indicated friendly aircraft. Any plane without stripes was to be considered hostile. The rule was simple. If it does not have stripes, shoot it down. The test flight also served another purpose. It validated that the stripes were visible at the distances and altitudes where identification decisions had to be made. The black and white pattern stood out dramatically against the sky. It was easier to see than standard roundels. It was distinctive enough that no confusion was possible. The test confirmed what the RAF had learned with Typhoons. Simple visual markings, properly designed, were more effective than complex electronics. But the test flight involved only a few aircraft. The real challenge lay ahead. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight Eisenhower had tentatively scheduled D-Day for June 5th. Weather forced a postponement to June 6th. That delay gave ground crews one additional precious day, but it also meant the window for painting was closing. On the evening of June 3, 1944, the order finally came down through official channels. All troop carrier units were to paint invasion stripes immediately. Not tomorrow, not next week. Tonight. Every C-47 transport, every glider tug, every aircraft that would drop paratroopers or tow gliders on D-Day. The paratroopers were scheduled to jump in the hours after midnight on June 6th. The aircraft had to be painted before they took off. Ground crews had approximately 48 hours to complete the work. On June 4th, the order went to fighter and bomber squadrons across Britain, every P-51 Mustang, every P-47 Thunderbolt, every P-38 Lightning, every Spitfire, Typhoon and Tempest, every B-26 Marauder and A-26 Invader, every Mosquito photo reconnaissance aircraft, every air-sea rescue plane. Thousands of aircraft, all to be painted in less than 48 hours. The scale was unprecedented. Nothing like it had ever been attempted. Ground crews scrambled. Paint supplies, carefully stockpiled in secret for weeks, were distributed to squadrons across England. 5-gallon cans of black, 5-gallon cans of white, brushes of all sizes. Rollers for large surfaces, masking tape to protect roundels and serial numbers. Written instructions on stripe width and placement. Diagrams showing proper application. Warnings about keeping national markings visible. The supplies arrived in trucks that drove through the night, headlights masked, following roads they had memorized in daylight. The work began immediately. Ground crews, who had worked all day maintaining aircraft, loading ammunition, fueling tanks, returned to the flight lines for another shift. This time they carried paint instead of tools. They set up portable lights around each aircraft. They measured and marked with chalk. They applied masking tape along the lines. They opened the paint cans and began the painstaking work of transforming thousands of aircraft. The physical labor was exhausting. Each aircraft required gallons of paint. Wings alone needed coverage from leading edge to trailing edge, top and bottom. Fuselages needed complete wrapping from the cockpit back to the tail. The paint had to be applied thick enough to be visible but not so thick. It added excessive weight. Crews worked in teams, some on ladders, some on scaffolds, some lying on wings. They painted in darkness, in cold, in wind. They worked until their arms ached and their backs screamed. Then they kept working. At RAF Leiston in Suffolk, ground crews worked through the night of June 4th painting P-51 Mustangs of the 375th Fighter Group. Captain Clarence Anderson, callsign Bud, was a veteran pilot with months of combat experience. When he walked to his aircraft on the morning of June 5th, he stopped in astonishment. Alternating 18-inch wide bands of 3 white and 2 black stripes covered his Mustang's wings and fuselage. Anderson could not believe how big they were. The stripes dominated the aircraft's appearance. Every other marking seemed insignificant by comparison. He had been told ground crews would paint special markings overnight. He had expected something subtle. What he saw was anything but subtle. The stripes were as big and bold as anything he had ever seen on an aircraft. Across Britain, the same scene repeated at hundreds of airfields. Pilots arriving for dawn briefings found their aircraft transformed. The familiar camouflage patterns were interrupted by stark black and white stripes. Some paint jobs were neat and precise. Others were hasty and rough. Ground crews had worked under intense time pressure. In many cases, they had only hours to complete the work. Some aircraft flew on D-Day with paint still wet. The logistics of the operation were extraordinary. Thousands of gallons of paint were consumed in less than 48 hours. Post-war reports claimed that most of the black and white paint in Britain was exhausted. Whether literally true or not, the statement captured the scale. Every airfield needed supplies, every squadron needed manpower. The work continued day and night. Some squadrons discovered they did not have enough paint. They improvised, mixing whatever black and white they could find. Some used whitewash, some used gloss, some used flat. The resulting stripes varied in appearance, but the pattern was consistent. 3 white stripes, 2 black, alternating. Unmistakable. The weather delay that postponed D-Day from June 5th to June 6th proved critical. Ground crews gained 1 additional day. Squadrons that would not have finished in time completed their painting. Aircraft that would have flown with partial stripes flew with full coverage. The postponement that frustrated commanders probably saved dozens of aircraft from friendly fire. At midnight on June 6, 1944, Operation Neptune, the air component of Operation Overlord, began. 23,400 Allied airborne troops loaded into transports and gliders at airfields across southern England. 822 aircraft carrying paratroopers toward Normandy. Hundreds more towed gliders loaded, with infantry, artillery, jeeps, supplies. All bore invasion stripes. All were unmistakable as they passed over the invasion fleet assembling in the English Channel. The paratroopers from the American 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions would jump first, securing the western flank of the invasion. British 6th Airborne Division would secure the eastern flank. The drops would begin at 0100 hours, 5.5 hours before the amphibious landings. The aircraft would have to fly over the most heavily defended invasion fleet ever assembled, 6,000 ships. Tens of thousands of anti-aircraft guns, crews that had been at battle stations for days, nerves stretched to breaking. Ships of the Allied naval force watched the armada pass overhead. Gunners who had been briefed about the invasion stripes saw the black and white patterns clearly against the night sky. Even in darkness, even through clouds, the contrast was visible. Even under stress, with hands on triggers, with adrenaline surging, the identification was certain. The aircraft were friendly. Hold fire, hold fire, hold fire. The discipline held throughout the fleet. Unlike Sicily, Where panic and confusion triggered a massacre, the protocols worked. Naval officers enforced fire discipline. Gunners followed orders. The identification system functioned exactly as designed. The transport planes were not fired upon by their own forces. The paratroopers were not shot while hanging from their parachutes. The airborne assault succeeded without the catastrophic friendly fire losses that had plagued Sicily. The invasion stripes had worked exactly as intended in their first real test. At dawn, as amphibious forces approached the beaches designated Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the sky filled with aircraft. Wave after wave of fighters providing combat air patrol over the landing zones. Squadrons of medium bombers attacking coastal defenses, targeting the concrete bunkers and artillery positions that threatened the beaches. Light bombers supporting the troops as they fought inland from the shore. Photo reconnaissance planes documenting the assault for intelligence analysis. All bearing invasion stripes, all unmistakably Allied, all protected by the simplest of identification systems. The Luftwaffe response was remarkably weak. German fighters had been relocated from France to Germany to defend against strategic bombing. Allied intelligence estimated that Germany had planned to have 5,000 aircraft available to prevent an invasion. By June 6, 1944, the German Air Force had been fought off its feet. Air Fleet 3, responsible for defending Western France, had just 319 serviceable planes facing nearly 13,000 Allied aircraft. On D-Day, the Luftwaffe flew one sortie for every 37 flown by the Allies. Only a dozen German fighter bombers reached the invasion zone. 10 dropped their bombs prematurely and fled. The most famous Luftwaffe appearance was made by two pilots, Ace Joseph Pips Priller and his wingman Heinz Wodarczyk. According to legend, both were hungover from partying the night before. They made a single strafing run over the beaches, drawing thousands of rounds of return fire, then disappeared. German soldiers on the ground later joked bitterly, "If you see grey planes, they are American. If you see black planes, they are British. If you see no planes at all, they are German." The joke captured the reality. Allied air supremacy was total. The invasion stripes were barely tested by enemy action because there was no enemy action to speak of, but the stripes were tested by the one threat that planners feared most. Friendly fire from a confused, exhausted, frightened gunner who fires first and asks questions later. That threat, which had killed 81 men over Sicily, was neutralized. As D-Day unfolded, friendly fire incidents involving aircraft were, thankfully, few. The simple paint scheme accomplished what complex electronics could not. Not everyone believed the stripes were necessary. Some argued that Allied air supremacy made them redundant. If German aircraft barely appeared, why worry about identification? The response from those who had been at Sicily was immediate and angry. The stripes were not insurance against German deception. They were insurance against human error. They were designed to prevent Allied forces from killing Allied forces. That threat did not disappear just because the Luftwaffe was weak. The stripes also served a psychological function. Soldiers on the beaches, pinned down by German fire, looked up and saw striped aircraft overhead. Unmistakably friendly. Unmistakably there to support them. The sight was reassuring. It reinforced the message that Allied air power dominated the battlefield. It reminded frightened men that they were not alone. For pilots, the stripes provided confidence. They knew that, as they flew low over the invasion beaches, as they strafed German positions, as they attacked coastal defenses, their own forces would not mistake them for enemies. They could focus on their mission without worrying about friendly fire. That psychological edge translated into more effective combat operations. The success of the invasion stripes was so complete that planners initially left them in place. For the first month after D-Day, all aircraft retained the full markings. But by mid-July, a problem emerged. The stripes on top of wings and fuselages made aircraft highly visible from above. Parked on forward airfields in Normandy, the striped planes stood out dramatically. They were easy targets for any German aircraft that managed to penetrate Allied air cover. On July 7, 1944, orders went out to remove the stripes from the upper surfaces of wings. The top of the fuselage could also be repainted in normal camouflage, but the undersides had to retain the topple stripes. Aircraft were still flying over Allied positions. Naval guns were still a threat. The identification system had to remain in place. By December 1944, the tactical situation had changed. Allied forces had broken out of Normandy. They were advancing across France toward Germany. The dense concentration of aircraft over a small beachhead no longer existed. The risk of friendly fire had decreased. On December 27, 1944, orders went out to remove all invasion stripes. Aircraft could return to standard markings, but the stripes had already entered history. Photographs from D-Day, showing Allied aircraft with their distinctive black and white bands, became iconic images of the invasion. The markings symbolized the unprecedented scale of the operation. They represented the coordination required to put 13,000 aircraft over the beaches. They demonstrated that even the largest military operation in history depended on simple solutions to complex problems. The statistical evidence supported the system's effectiveness. On D-Day, 11,590 Allied aircraft flew 14,674 sorties. Of those, 127 planes were lost. The loss rate was less than 1%. Most losses were from German anti-aircraft fire or mechanical failure. Friendly fire incidents were minimal. The contrast with Sicily was stark. There, 23 aircraft out of 144 had been shot down by Allied guns, a 16% loss rate from friendly fire alone. Historians would later calculate that the invasion stripes probably saved 500 or more aircraft from friendly fire during June 1944. 500 aircraft, each carrying crew members, each representing millions of dollars in equipment, each contributing to air superiority over the beaches. The stripes did not just save planes, they saved lives, maintained combat effectiveness, and ensured that Allied air power could be applied where it was needed most. The psychological impact on German forces was significant. Prisoners captured after D-Day consistently reported feeling overwhelmed by Allied air presence. They described the sky as being filled with aircraft, endless waves, constant attacks, no respite. The visual impact of thousands of striped aircraft reinforced the sense that Germany faced an enemy with unlimited resources. One German officer, captured near Caen in late June, told his interrogators about watching the invasion from a concrete bunker. For 3 hours after dawn, he said, there was not a single moment when I could not see Allied aircraft overhead. They appeared in formations of 30, 40, 50 planes, all marked with black and white stripes, all clearly friendly to each other, all clearly deadly to us. I knew at that moment we had lost the war. The success of the invasion stripes influenced military planning for decades. During the Korean War, United Nations aircraft used similar markings during major operations. In the 1956 Suez Crisis, British and French aircraft were painted with black and yellow stripes. The principle remained the same. Simple visual markings, applied uniformly, could prevent friendly fire more effectively than complex technology. Modern military forces use different systems. Electronic identification has improved dramatically since 1944. Radar technology, satellite communications, and sophisticated IFF systems can track thousands of aircraft simultaneously. But the fundamental problem remains. In the chaos of combat, when systems fail or communications break down, human beings must make split-second identification decisions. The temptation to solve that problem with paint and visual markings never entirely disappeared. In 1985, 41 years after D-Day, surviving veterans of the Normandy invasion gathered for a reunion in Thème, France. Among them were pilots who had flown striped aircraft over the beaches, gunners who had held their fire because they recognized the markings, paratroopers who had jumped from transports that made it through because ships did not fire. One veteran, a former anti-aircraft gunner on a destroyer, described his memory of D-Day. He had been at his station since midnight. He had watched the armada of transport planes pass overhead in darkness. He had seen the black and white stripes even in the dark. His fingers had been on the trigger. His orders were clear. If the planes had not been striped, he would have fired. He would have killed American paratroopers. Instead, he held fire. The stripes saved lives, he said simply. Mine included. Because if I had fired on our own planes, if I had killed our own men, I could not have lived with that. The story of the invasion stripes is ultimately a story about learning from failure. The tragedy over Sicily in July 1943 was not inevitable. It resulted from poor planning, inadequate training, and communication failures. 83 men died because those failures were not corrected, but their deaths were not meaningless. The investigation that followed identified specific problems. Solutions were developed, procedures were changed, technology was improved. The invasion stripes were only one element of that improvement. Training programs were expanded, communication protocols were standardized, IFF systems were upgraded, fire discipline was emphasized at every level, but the stripes were the most visible symbol of the change. They represented a commitment that another Sicily would not happen. That promise was kept. Major General Matthew Ridgway, who had watched his paratroopers die over Sicily, lived to see the invasion of Normandy succeed without similar losses. In his memoirs, written decades later, he reflected on the lessons of that terrible night in July 1943. The deplorable loss to life could have been prevented, he wrote. But once it occurred, we had a choice. We could accept it as inevitable, as the price of war, as unavoidable tragedy, or we could learn from it. We could identify what went wrong. We could fix the problems. We could ensure it never happened again. We chose to learn. We chose to fix the problems. The invasion stripes were part of that fix. They were not a perfect solution. They did not prevent every friendly fire incident, but they prevented hundreds. They saved lives. They contributed to the success of the largest military operation in history. That is their legacy. The ground crews who painted the stripes, working through the night of June 3rd and 4th, 1944, did not know they were making history. They were following orders, mixing paint, applying brushes to aluminum, masking off roundels, checking measurements. The work was tedious, physically demanding, and performed under extreme time pressure. Many probably wondered if it was necessary. Whether simple paint could really make a difference, the pilots who flew striped aircraft on D-Day knew the answer. Captain Bud Anderson, who had been so surprised by the boldness of the markings, flew his striped P-51 Mustang on the longest mission of his life. He provided air cover over the beaches for hours. He flew low enough to see the landing craft approaching the shore. He was within range of dozens of ships equipped with anti-aircraft guns. Not one of them fired at him. "The stripes worked," he said in a post-war interview. "I knew they worked when I flew over that fleet and nobody shot at me. Those stripes saved my life." Thousands of other pilots could have said the same. Thousands of aircrew members owed their survival to ground crews they never met, who painted stripes they initially thought were excessive. Thousands of soldiers on the beaches looked up at striped aircraft and knew they had support. The impact rippled through every level of the operation. The invasion stripes also represented something larger. They symbolized the incredible organizational capacity that won the war. The ability to coordinate thousands of aircraft, to supply hundreds of gallons of paint to hundreds of airfields simultaneously, to execute a plan that touched every squadron in Britain within 48 hours, to maintain security despite involving thousands of people. That organizational capacity, more than any single weapon or technology, determined the outcome of World War II. The stripes themselves were mundane: black paint, white paint, brushes, and time. Nothing sophisticated, nothing complex, no advanced technology, no secret weapons, just simple markings that solved a simple problem. Human beings under stress cannot reliably identify aircraft by silhouette. Give them a distinctive pattern that cannot be missed. Problem solved. That willingness to embrace simple solutions, when simple solutions were appropriate, characterized the Allied approach throughout the war. Not every problem required complex technology. Sometimes the best answer was paint and brushes. Sometimes effectiveness mattered more than elegance. Sometimes saving lives meant painting stripes on thousands of airplanes in 48 hours. The legacy of the invasion stripes extends beyond their immediate tactical success. They demonstrated that even in the largest military operations, small details matter. That communication between services is essential. That learning from past mistakes can prevent future tragedies. That simple solutions, properly implemented, can save hundreds of lives. These lessons remain relevant decades after the stripes were removed. In June 1944, as Allied forces established their foothold in Normandy, as thousands of aircraft flew overhead bearing black and white stripes, as the greatest invasion in history unfolded successfully, Lieutenant Colonel Reuben Tucker was there, the officer who had survived the disaster over Sicily, who had watched his men die from friendly fire, who had vowed it would never happen again. Tucker did not write memoirs. He did not give speeches about the invasion stripes, but in private conversations with fellow officers, he expressed quiet satisfaction. The lessons of Sicily had been learned. The price paid in blood had purchased knowledge. That knowledge had been applied. The system worked. Men who would have died lived instead. That was enough. The story of why American and British pilots started painting stripes on wings is not primarily about technology or tactics. It is about the cost of learning in war, about paying for knowledge with lives, about the obligation to ensure those lives were not wasted, about the determination to prevent the same tragedy from occurring twice. 81 men died over Sicily because Allied forces shot down their own aircraft. That number should have been 0. The fact that it was not 0 represented failure. But the response to that failure, the systematic effort to understand what went wrong and fix it, represented something more important than success. It represented a commitment to learning, to improvement, to protecting the lives entrusted to commanders. The invasion stripes saved approximately 500 aircraft from friendly fire in June 1944. Each of those aircraft carried men, pilots, navigators, gunners, crew chiefs. Each loss prevented was a life saved. The 81 who died over Sicily purchased the survival of thousands over Normandy. Their sacrifice was not meaningless. It was transformed into a system that worked. When the last invasion stripes were removed in December 1944, when aircraft returned to standard markings, when the black and white paint faded from history into memory, the lesson remained. Simple solutions to complex problems, learning from failure, protecting your own forces as carefully as you attack the enemy. Communication, between services, training until recognition becomes instinct, fire discipline under stress. These principles did not begin with the invasion stripes, they did not end with them. But the stripes provided a perfect example of their application. They showed what could be accomplished when military organizations commit to solving problems rather than accepting casualties. They demonstrated that caring about losses, learning from mistakes, and implementing solutions could save lives at scale. The ground crews who painted thousands of aircraft in 48 hours never received medals. Their names do not appear in history books. They worked through nights mixing paint, applying brushes, checking measurements. They were exhausted, stressed, working under impossible time pressure. They succeeded anyway. Their success meant pilots lived, crews survived, missions succeeded. The invasion stripes of D-Day remain one of the most recognizable symbols of the Second World War. Photographs of D-Day, striped aircraft are displayed in museums. Models are built by enthusiasts. Historians write about their significance. But the true importance of those simple black and white bands lies not in their visual impact. It lies in the lives they saved, in the lesson they taught, in the proof they provided that learning from tragedy can prevent its repetition. That is why pilots painted stripes on wings. Not for identification alone, not for tactical advantage, but because 81 men died over Sicily and their deaths demanded meaning. The stripes gave those deaths meaning. They transformed tragedy into prevention. They turned failure into success. They saved 500 aircraft and thousands of lives. They showed that sometimes the difference between catastrophe and triumph is nothing more than black paint, white paint, and the determination to learn from the past.